Hello and welcome to another edition of the News Project Live. This is episode 13, Disinformation and the Election, How News Organizations Can Cut Through Lies. Our guest is Noah Shachtman, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast. He has written about technology and defense for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and more. The News Project Live is a weekly conversation with media industry experts and innovators about the future of news, brought to you by the News Project. Our hosts are Merrill Brown, CEO, and Alex Leo, Head of Audience. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube.
Good evening, I'm Merrill Brown from New York City. Welcome to tonight's edition of the News Project Live. We come to you tonight after a hiatus of a few weeks, and we're pleased to be back. For those of you joining us for the first time, we're glad to have you. And for those of you who have joined us before, thanks for returning. Please let us know where you're viewing from and send along questions. Thursday evenings with co-host Alex Leo, TNP brings you smart media minds to talk about news industry business issues that make the future of news gathering and news organizations so challenging. We'll be addressing disinformation tonight. And please join us next Thursday at 6 ET for what should be a fascinating discussion about the state of newspapers and the Los Angeles Times in particular with its executive editor, the fabled journalist Norm Pearlstein. Tonight, we dive into one of the stories of the moment, the spread of disinformation, its impact on the election, and how news professionals are dealing with the challenge. Our guest is responsible for one of the most aggressive news organizations about that, and they focus on disinformation regularly, doing so with rich reporting and a variety of applications and writers and stories from around the world. The site is the Daily Beast, and joining us is its editor-in-chief, Noah Shachtman. At our company, The News Project, we help small to medium-sized news organizations address the product and business challenges that face news today. Our work has ranged from a news site in Brooklyn to a newspaper in Montana and one of California's most influential news organizations. We provide a comprehensive platform and set of technologies and services the news operations need to put these customers and others in a position to build audience and seek sustainable models. More on our work later in the program when co-host Alex Leo and I provide you with a bit of a look at TNP. Alex joins us tonight from her home in Washington, D.C. Good evening, Alex.
Hi, Merrill. So it seems we as a culture did not consider the ramifications of social media in general, but social media combined with disintegrating trust in institutions and the press, combined with bad actors, has led us here. And I'm hoping this conversation helps our audience further understand the problem and any potential solutions. Please send us your questions for Noah, or anyone that we're talking with tonight, which is me, Merrill, and Noah. And tell us where you're watching from and say hi, and we'll talk to you on air. Merrill?
Thanks, Alex. We come to you tonight just about under 24 hours after a presidential debate unlike any we've seen before. Much of the commentary about the debate focused on President Trump's willingness to share questionable assertions about the state of voting and the state of his challenger, Joe Biden's family. These are presidential debate points based, at least in part, on disinformation. What was previously just a corner of the political debate now finds itself central to how we'll elect a president in just a few weeks. Joining us to pull this apart is Noah Shachtman, who has run the Daily Beast for the past 2 years after serving as its executive editor for 4 years before that. He has reported from around the world, written extensively about technology and national security, was executive editor of news at Foreign Policy, and ran Wired's national security blog. His experience wrestling with the topic tonight is extensive. Noah, welcome to the News Project Live. We're thrilled to have you. Before we dive into the substance of our conversation, tell us about lockdown life for you running the Daily Beast from Vermont.
Yeah, I'm in Vermont right now, Peru, Vermont, population 367, where the internet is sometimes great and sometimes not so great. So apologies if my screen's a little bit pixelated. Look, it's been great. Luckily, our team of reporters and editors and photographers and social media pros is, they're really flexible. They're really mission driven. And so, doing this under lockdown has been a bit of a challenge, but it's been more of like a real privilege to see so many people committed and so many people, in action.
And you've been doing it, I assume, since early March, like much of the news world?
Yeah, that's right. First we were up in my grandparents' place down the road, and now we're here.
Good. Well, I'm glad the Daily Beast has continued uninterrupted for those of us who enjoy it every day. Thank you. To dive right in, so what are the major threads of the disinformation campaigns we've seen around the world during this election cycle?
Well, before I get to that, I just want to tease out a point you made at the top, which is how central disinformation is to this year's election. Look, in 2016, you could argue that there are several layers between the candidates and the engines of propaganda. You would have something perhaps seeded by a Russian troll that would bubble up on a subreddit that might get captured by a popular Twitter account and might eventually get retweeted by one of the president's or then candidate Trump's staff. These days, there's almost no barrier between the disinformation and the White House. And in fact, much of the most virulent disinformation is either being endorsed by or is coming from the White House itself. And to me, that's like the really big shift this time is there is no parallel disinformation campaign. The disinformation is central to the 2020 political race.
Thank you for supporting my point, Noah, and reinforcing it.
You're a genius, dude.
Yeah. So what are the major threads that are so influential in all this?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of major threads. I mean, I think first off, there's one we're facing right now, and it is sorry, my 7-year-old, who's an awesome kid, was just yelling in the background there. So the first one is about the integrity of the voting situation itself, right? Is it safe to show up to the polls? Will your vote be counted if you mail it in? Is there fraud if you around mail-in ballots? And there's just been a storm of disinformation about that. Next, there's been a storm of disinformation around just the general safety and security of our cities and suburbs, right? You listen to the president and you would think that New York is a burning hellscape at all times where, zombies run free and living people do not. In fact, it's very much the opposite. I was back home this weekend enjoying a lovely meal outdoors and listening to some jazz and playing in the parks with my kids. But if you are not in those cities, the message you get from the president and from his chosen outlets is that it is pure chaos there, and that chaos is coming for you. So there's that. And then there's a converse set of disinformation attacks coming on the relative safety or not of dealing with the pandemic, right? And about the health and security information around the pandemic. And, you've heard the president say over and over again that it's going to disappear like a miracle, that, he's been very cute about whether mask wearing and social distancing is necessary. And even though he knew better, as we learned in the Bob Woodward tapes. So to me, those are the disinformation around COVID, the disinformation around the integrity of voting, and disinformation about the relative safety of our cities and suburbs. Those are the three main attacks this time around.
Yeah, and in 2016, we were very focused on Russia. And now, as you said, a lot of the disinformation is coming from the White House itself. But are there other state actors this time around that are pushing this information?
Russia is still is still the king of the disinformation game from the foreign threats. China and Iran have both also contributed their own disinformation games, but they are minor in comparison to what Russia is doing. Remember, someone who the U.S. has designated as a Russian agent, an active Russian agent, pushed information that made its way into the hands of Rudy Giuliani, onto the airwaves of OANN, one of the president's favorite networks, made its way to Devin Nunes, the Republican head of the House Intelligence Committee, and also made its way to Senator Ron Johnson, who recently led this inquiry into the Bidens that was supposed to be a big blockbuster report and kind of fell apart at the last minute. So Russia's kind of the big one. China and Iran are playing along a little bit, but they're in much more minor roles.
I'm going to quickly say hi to our viewers, Steve, viewing from Vienna, Virginia, Corey Salka from Phoenix, Arizona, and Thomas Brew, who says the wave of disinformation makes a strong case for day drinking. So Noah, as you said, the state actors, Russia isn't completely new to this. We may have taken more notice in the past few years, but they've been pushing, misinformation about race and tensions in America for years, haven't they?
Correct, for decades.
Yeah.
I mean, it famously even got behind, tried and not very successfully to push JFK's candidacy in 1960 because they thought that Richard Nixon was a more experienced hand on the world stage. So yeah, this has been going on for a very long time.
Noah, let's talk about your role as editor. So this week, just the other day, the DNI released information making claims about Hillary Clinton and Russia. It was treated like news by some outlets. Now, I don't know about most. And so you're handed that story in your news meeting, and you're told DNI has put this statement out, this so-called information. How do you assess what to do with that, especially in the context of whether you even report on it, since you know it to be modest, of questionable value?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I think framing in these situations is incredibly important. And so if you're going to frame something as DNI releases X, you've really failed at your job because you haven't captured the context of what's really going on here. So our frame, as many other places did it, was, DNI releases Russian propaganda unfiltered. Mm-hmm. That's the real, in other words, the context is sometimes more important than the action itself. And so you've got to be incredibly careful on how you frame things in today's environment.
Do you run it? How do you treat it? You don't treat it like an authoritative press release. You make judgments about it, right? How did you handle that story, for instance?
Well, I believe it came out either on Yom Kippur or the day after, so I was off actually. Right. But our news organization, which has really inculcated these values about not taking what people in power say for granted. Framed it just the way I described and framed it essentially as a Russian propaganda op with assistance from the Trump administration.
And this is a really important kind of utilitarian point for the people who are in our audience, many of whom run newsrooms or are part of news organizations. You used to take an announcement, as we did about Russia, for instance, in early 2017. We used to take announcements like that a bit on their face, right? Way more than we do today. What do you urge newsrooms to do in the context of when they're handed a story like this from what used to be a reputable and even authoritative source?
Yeah, I would say that also extends to police reporting, right? We're seeing so many instances right now about how the cops say something about a controversial incident, for instance, handling of the protests, or about a controversial violent incident like with Breonna Taylor, and that their claims just fall apart after evidence is evaluated. And so I think we've all got to be much more suspicious of what those in authority say. And, we just can't take this stuff at face value. And we can't start retaking it at face value if there's a change in administrations in Washington. Got to be skeptical of what's out there.
So in this vein, Merrill, of kind of telling news organizations what they can do to be better, can you tell our audience a little bit about what we do at TNP?
Alex, thank you. We do many things at TNP, but the most important thing we do is that we provide technology and services for newsrooms that help them deal with some of the challenges they face so they can focus on the journalism. So we provide a platform we've built. We spent a lot of time and energy building it so that news services can do exactly what they do with our technology and get our advice from really qualified people like you. And we should mention here that you ran audience development at a place called the Daily Beast not that long ago. So we offer audience development services. You see the eight of the things we do here. We offer a content management system, technology, experts like Alex to help you think through your challenges, audience development, registration and tiered management so you can work on reader revenue, a variety of revenue streams, partnerships to help you build distribution, and business intelligence and insights. So if you're running a news organization or if you'd like to start one, please get in touch with us. We'd love to help you. You can write Alex at alex@thenewsproject.net or me at Merrill@thenewsproject.net, and we'd love to help you and talk through how you think about the challenges you face. Alex?
Great. Noah, we have a question from viewer Steve Delphin. How does the rise and spread of disinformation correlate to the shrinking of traditional journalism?
That's a good question. I think there's certainly a correlation, but I'm not sure there's a causation. It's certainly true that the rise of disinformation has occurred at the same time that we've seen a lot of local news organizations shrink, and that we've seen some venture capital funded digital news operations start to rise and start to fall after a meteoric rise. I think that creates some additional dangers, of course, with the rise of disinformation. I'd say what disinformation is there's a more causal relationship with is the rise of Facebook. Because Facebook has really prioritized engagement and hot emotion over truth. It's allowed disinformation peddlers to gain a foothold and to gain more than a foothold, to gain huge audiences very quickly by gaming Facebook's algorithm in a way that traditional news organizations cannot. So I'd say that's the real link.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Facebook, if you don't mind. They employ fact checkers. They're claiming to do more. Obviously, they're extraordinarily controversial at this point in time. How do you look at the Facebook problem, and how do you think about your at least theoretical dependence on Facebook, like other news organizations, for distribution and eyeballs?
Well, as Alex can tell you, we are much less reliant on Facebook than other publishers, thank God. And I'll also tell you, just to give Facebook a little bit of credit, I think they have gotten very serious about the foreign disinformation threat. Right. And I think that one of the reasons that we haven't seen a major overseas attack on our elections this time around is in part because Facebook and the other platforms have gotten much more serious about it. And when they see, Russian disinformation, they zap it pretty quickly, and you've seen that time and time again. So give them some credit for that. But look, how they're doing overall, they've committed to a way to share information and to publish. Let's get real, they're a publisher that values anger and values emotion and values engagement above all. And they have been completely unwilling to change that. And so, yes, it's true that they, have a army of part-time content moderators. And yes, it's true that they've made some alliances with some fact-checking operations. But all of that is basically for window dressing until they handle the core elements of their algorithm. Until they address that, all this other stuff is, just bogus.
Yeah, that seems exactly right. And you're talking about foreign intervention, and you're right, they have addressed some of that. But when the limited data that we do get about the top most shared from page stories, it's always Franklin Graham and the Breitbart, and the things that perform very well seem to be a right-wing echo chamber of disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah, and there was probably a case they could have made a couple of years ago that they were doing so in a value neutral way, but it's just really not the case anymore. And it's pretty clearly they've decided that they are okay with pushing the most furthest right propaganda. And I'm sure you guys all saw this Politico article the other day in which, as a way of excuse, a Facebook executive said, well, it's not really our fault. This stuff has been going on since the 1930s, basically saying that they were publishing the modern equivalent of Nazi propaganda and that they couldn't do anything about it. But of course, they can do something about it. They can change what gets valued on their publishing system, but they choose not to. Why they choose not to, I think, is a matter of intense speculation that I don't think anybody quite knows.
You expect to, and would you favor a regulatory solution to the problem?
I mean, look, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not an antitrust lawyer. It does seem that
said,
no, I mean, look, they're clearly a publisher, right? So they make editorial choices all day long. They have in their employ a team of writers and editors, and so therefore they should be treated like a publisher. And if they're hosting, libelous or slanderous content, I think they should be, held responsible for that.
Noah, you all like breaking stories on this topic. You've devoted a lot of energy to it, and for that, we're appreciative. One of the stories you broke just the other day was about the publicist for Dr. Fauci writing under a pseudonym on conservative-leaning websites, and there's the story itself. It's up on the screen. I don't know if you can see it or not, Noah, but how did you get to that story? And is the phenomena of pseudonyms, of people who don't want to reveal who they are because of the jobs they have, is that a real thing we're going to be reading more about?
I don't want to get too much into the reporting, but just suffice it to say it was a combination of both technical reporting and kind of old school shoe leather reporting that led us to be able to verify that. Right. And look, I'm pleased to say that Fauci's shop, as soon as they learned about it, had the guy retire a couple hours later, excuse me. So, they took quick action once they realized. In terms of pseudonyms, look, it must have been in the early 90s when there was that cartoon about on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. So the idea of identity and shrouded identity has been with us since the beginning. So I don't think it's necessarily a new phenomenon, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing. In fact, it can be quite a good thing. And some of my favorite writers either started out or continue to be writing under pseudonyms. So I think that's fine. I think, the problem in this particular case, right, was this guy was calling for the execution of scientists that were like literally working down the hall from him. And the scientists weren't aware that there was this kind of monster in the building, and, it was a matter of safety for them. Also, HHS, I'm sorry, not HHS, NIH, National Institutes of Health, were hiring this guy to put out, factual information about coronavirus and other things. And instead he was putting out disinformation while on the company dime. And that was the really serious issue.
I hadn't really thought about pseudonyms, and maybe you had before in other contexts, but that's one of those surprises that I think we're going to see a lot of over the coming weeks. What worries you that you'd like to give us a heads up about that's coming up? And to pick an example, are you going to send dozens of reporters around to stand at polling places on November 3rd and see who's outside potentially harassing voters? Yeah,
that's still in progress, but we'll certainly be on the lookout for that in a variety of ways. We are incredibly concerned about the interference in the act of voting. We're incredibly concerned about how Trump may be using the tools of the state to further his own reelection prospects. And, we see that this guy, kind of uses, what was thought to be our taxpayer institutions as his personal playthings. The thing that really jumps out to me is like using the Department of Justice's lawyers to defend himself against rape allegations by Eugene Carroll. So, I think those are two of the major themes that we are on the lookout for. And then the other thing that I'm concerned about is that the mismanagement of COVID and the clamp down on the election may go hand in hand. That said, look, I think we've seen over the spring and summer that it's very possible to hold safe in-person elections. Kentucky, for example, had a very hotly contested set of primaries over the summer, and there was no, they had a socially distant way of voting, and it went off without a hitch. So it is very possible to do in-person voting. It's particularly possible to do safe in-person early voting. And so we're going to be looking at that a lot. We're going to be trying to triumph some successes as well.
How about the military? Noah, how do you go? Sorry, Alex. How do you go about thinking about how to keep an eye on the military in the context of disinformation and what might be ahead of us over the next 4.5 weeks?
Not sure. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you have in mind?
Well, I mean, things like the clearing out of Lafayette Park, things like I think the inevitable confrontation that's going to happen when Trump asked the Pentagon to man the polls. I think all that is ahead of us. Use of the military as we get closer to the election day, I think, is going to be a topic of discussion.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm a little less concerned about using the uniformed military than I am some of these sort of quasi-uniformed little green men that were used by the Department of Justice and by DHS. I think that's where the real concern is, and we're digging in there.
Alex?
So I'm going to try to pull some threads together here, Noah. So take whatever one of them you want. But you guys had a big story today about a New York Times reporter whose work has been called into question now that her source was arrested in Canada. Yeah. And, when you're talking to unreliable sources, the Daily Beast has done a really good job hiring people who are very competent at reporting on disinformation. But how do you make sure that when you're dealing with dishonest characters, that you're getting a real story for your readers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I know Maggie Haberman's talked about this a lot when reporting on the Trump administration, and she's the best. You've got to be very careful when you're dealing in this case in the White House, where basically everybody is a liar, and you have to. You can't just rely on a single or two, unnamed sources. You've really got to triangulate. You've really got to see what that Venn diagram is between what everybody else is saying, and then go in there, and in there lies the truth. So you've got to be very careful about sourcing. You've got to use documentary evidence when you can. And look, sometimes you can't show all your sourcing to your audience, unfortunately. There are off the record agreements and what have you, but you can be very careful, and obviously the bigger the story, the more careful you have to be. So we work really hard just to try to be as skeptical as possible, even skeptical of information that from sources that have provided good information in the past.
Noah, how do you go about, and how would you recommend other journalists go about actually covering what gets posted in social media, as vast and as challenging as that sounds?
That's a great question, and it's one we wrestle with all the time. Look, rando posts, random awful thing is not a story, right? It has to gain some traction, in my view, or it has to be embraced by people in power. Then it can be reported on. And honestly, even let me walk back the first thing I said. Even gaining traction, even like certain thing goes viral, I don't think is by itself a story. It really has to be at the intersection of power or culture and virality, and then it's a story. And I'd be very careful. A lot of news organizations right now, often good news organizations, will throw a reporter on kind of like the social beat, and that person will just write up whatever happens to be trending, and it leads to some really bad journalism from ordinarily good places. And so I think that it has to intersect with these larger themes, or else it's really not worth talking about.
I ask you that in part in the context of what I read about all the time, and that is the influence that posts from odd places or from Russia or from phony news organizations have in the right-wing ecosystem, a world in which I'm not a participant. And I often wonder what those stories are all about. What is having influence in a world in which I'm not a part? How do you track that? And isn't it an important service of journalism to try to unveil what those memes or stories are?
Yeah, of course. Just because you may not participate in it doesn't mean that millions of Americans don't.
That's my point.
And we're in an age in which the membrane between the right-wing media ecosystem and the federal government is almost non-existent, right? And so the reason that some of these influence stories are so important is that something can go from rando on Twitter to the Daily Caller to the president's feed to national policy in a matter of minutes. And so how do we go about that? Look, we've got people that are in it, or that monitor that beat, like our national security reporters monitor their beat, or like our White House reporter monitors his beat. And I'd add those people are sourced in their beats too, and so you'd be surprised. One thing Alex will remember is that many of the people who decry the Daily Beast as fake news and gnash their teeth in public the loudest about us are also the same people that are leaking to us all the time, which is a fun little game.
And would you recommend that metropolitan newspapers, for example, or local blogs adopt some of these techniques in covering their local ecosystems as people are reading about COVID and politics and so on and so forth?
Look, the job of a local editor is really tough, and so I wouldn't presume to tell them what to do. As a consumer of local news, I want to hear about stuff that's on the street. Let us internet people cover the internet, but I want to hear about the stuff that's offline that you really need old school shoe leather reporting for. So give me that, and give me some sports, and give me some activities and entertainment, and that's what I'm looking for.
I warned you I was going to pull the button if you went into the Yankee world. So thanks for not doing so, Alex.
So yeah, that's what we're talking about, the internet world and your well-sourced reporters. I wanted to talk a little bit about QAnon, which has been such a big phenomenon. It's basically Monsters Inc. played sideways, where a group of the conspiracy theory that a group of elite pedophiles kidnap and eat children for a hormone that makes them live forever, if I'm summing it up properly. And I'm just wondering, it's gaining steam. Some of the reports recently have said upwards of 7% of voters are, aware in a positive way about it. I'm just wondering, what are the mechanisms that this thing has gained so much steam? And how do you report on it without spreading it more?
Yeah. So, first of all, we're having a robust conversation within our newsroom about how to label QAnon. Is it a conspiracy theory? Is it a violent cult? Is it a terrorist Is it a terrorist ideology? And the truth is, it's probably some combination of the three. Look, QAnon supporters are actively encouraging and, in some cases, abetting the kidnapping of children. We've seen QAnon supporters behind several acts of both threatened and real violence. And so it is very serious to deal with. How's it spreading? Like we talked about before, Facebook is a major part of it. And while Facebook is taking some action now to try to slow it down, in some case, in this case, the proverbial Pandora's box has been opened. And, and I'd also say that QAnon thrives in an environment in which, the government has done so much damage to the concept of truth. And when, the whole point of this kind of Putin-style propaganda, which the Trump administration has pushed, it is not to convince you of a certain point or not. It's to make you give up and stop believing in truth altogether, so that everything seems plausible. And so that's the information environment in which QAnon thrives. Honestly, it reminds me a lot of my reporting from Afghanistan and in Iraq back in the day, when both people in both countries had lived under repressive regimes that lied to them all the time, and so they were prone to believe conspiracy theories because, in fact, that was the only sane way to live, because what they were hearing from their official channels was just simply untrue.
A couple more questions, Noah. We'll let you get off to dinner, which apparently is in the next room.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. But first of all, a business question, if you don't mind. One of the things that we talk about a lot at the News Project is the importance of reader revenue.
Yeah.
You all are very aggressive about getting people to subscribe to the parts of the Daily Beast that are behind the subscription wall. How are you doing at that, and what's your approach to that in terms of how you decide what editorial goes where and who gets what?
Yeah, our corporate overlords, I think, would feed me to the local wolves if I talk specific numbers, but it's gone very, very, very well. And, month after month, we're hitting new highs. What are we doing? We're taking a variety of tactics. If I understand your question, there's certain kinds of content that we're putting completely behind the paywall, and we experiment with that. There are certain kinds of content that are behind the paywall for a limited amount of time. And then we also use a dynamic paywall in which, if you come to the Daily Beast a lot, we're going to eventually ask you to pay for what you're reading. And so it's not a hard number of articles like some other sites do, but we try to tailor it to where you're reading us from, what kind of articles you're reading, and how much you're consuming in let's say a week or a month. But that's what we're doing. We've also got some subscriber-only newsletters from one about the British royals called The Royalist, which is the best newsletter about Meghan Markle that you will ever read. And if you are obsessed about the royals, you will love this. To a best-in-class newsletter called Pay Dirt, which is about money and sleaze in politics. And so, we're trying a bunch of different ways. And, I think we'll try to do even more, going forward. For example, a bunch of other shops have done nicely with subscriber-only episodes to podcasts. We're starting to play in that a little bit too. And there'll be some other stuff rolling out next year.
But this all lives within the context of something you mentioned earlier, right? Which is that you're not as dependent on third-party traffic as some other organizations. You're focused on people that are loyal to you, that want to engage with the Daily Beast, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're still dependent on third-party traffic, just not as much as other places. And we try to grow that loyalty segment and turn casual readers into fans and turn fans into subscribers. And ultimately, I think that's the path for everybody. I was around at the earliest stages of internet news and internet advertising, and there was a mistake made, which was that the internet was viewed as a marketing channel, not as a publishing platform. And so therefore it was, news was given away for free. And that was a bad idea that we're still paying the consequences for. So while we'll keep it, we'll always keep, sort of breaking news and important health and safety information and, all that free for everyone, I think us and everybody else are going to move more and more towards a subscription model.
Absolutely. We have one more question from our viewer, if you'll bear with us, from Steve.
Sure.
Should we be concerned? We haven't talked about this yet. So should we be concerned about the outsized influence that conservative news ops like Sinclair, Fox, etc., have had on local news?
Yes.
Yes.
I haven't thought too much about it, but local news is not necessarily my bag. But like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all remember that incredible video from a couple of years ago that
Deadspin.
that Deadspin did, in which you had all these Sinclair network anchors reading the same nonsense. I think it's very much a concern.
I'd like to wrap up if we can, Alex. Noah, with one last question. We have a number of questions from viewers about where to go to get to the truth and to figure out where disinformation is. In addition, of course, to the Daily Beast and, you know, sort of the obvious sources, do you have any go-to places you go to that cut through this that you can recommend to our audience?
Well, I mean, if you're just talking about trusted news sites, I mean, I think my guess is that the people watching this, you know what a good trusted news site is. I think, you know, this time around, in addition to the big papers, I think, you know, NBC News is doing a really nice job on the information beat, thanks to a couple of Daily Beast veterans named Brandy Zadrozny and Ben Collins. I think Politico has had a really strong cycle in breaking a ton of good stories. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of great journalism being out there right now, and in some ways, look, I view this as a golden age of journalism. I mean, it's just big story after big story, day after day after day. But you do have to, you know, over time, get to know your news outlets and evaluate them, you know, slowly over time about, you know, whether you trust them or not, and then try to keep a diverse diet. You know, if you're a liberal, read some conservative news sites, and vice versa. You may not agree with everything they write, and you may think a lot of it's BS, but there are going to be interesting nuggets in there that are worth reading. And, you know, one of the things I'm proud of at the Daily Beast is that we've been able to take people that came from right and left wing, you know, shops and fuse them together to make some great reporting. And we're going to continue to do that.
Noah, thank you very much. In the middle of what is obviously, as you point out, a busy news cycle. Thanks for spending some time with us, and thanks for both informing us and frightening us, which is what news is about these days for many of us. And we appreciate that, and we appreciate your time. We hope to have you back on again after the election to talk about it.
Sure thing.
To our viewers, thank you, Alex. And to our viewers, thanks for joining us. Thanks for enduring this multi-week hiatus without us. We'll be a regular part of your Thursday evenings, we hope, going forward. And tune in next Thursday at 6 Eastern, when we'll have one of the most preeminent newspaper editors of our day, Norm Pearlstein, on to talk about the LA Times, the current news cycle and the elections, and what he sees ahead for the business model of journalism. Thank you all again. Have a pleasant weekend, and we'll hopefully see you next Thursday. Good night.